All right, welcome back, everyone. My name is Andres Monroy Hernandez. I'm a faculty member here in the CITP and the Computer Science Department. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Erin Duffy, who is coming from Cornell University in the Department of Communications. Um, she's been studying a lot of work, a lot of the creative economy and how people kind of navigate all these platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and how they make a living out of that and how they are kind of part of this influencer community. So I'm very excited to learn more about the work she's been doing. This work, I think, is coming in a book coming soon. Soon. We're all here to help shape maybe the book as well. And one fun fact about Erin is that she's a big fan of the Richard Marx, 80s musician. So if you have any questions about 80s music, feel free to ask at the end as well. With that, welcome.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to those of you for being here. I'm truly delighted to visit. This is my first time on the campus, and I'm convinced that every day is 60 degrees and sunny and lovely. So as Andre said, I'm going to be presenting the arc of my latest book project, but I really look forward to feedback as I soon is a bit ambitious. I'm trying to finish this by next year. And the book essentially uses visibility as an analytic framework to think through the promises, perils, and precarities of the so-called creator economy. And so most of you are probably aware that February is Black History Month in the US. You may not be aware that many platform companies, from Meta to YouTube to TikTok and Twitch, amplify, boost, elevate the voices of a select group of creators of color as part of so-called incubator programs. Perhaps not surprisingly, a lot of these initiatives, and I have some up here, were launched in the wake of the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement and were a purported reckoning with racial injustice. And so some consider these sorts of initiatives as an important step in redressing racial injustice and providing creators with forms of economic and social capital. Others critique these as kind of corporate lip service, where we are seeing the aims of racial justice routed through commercial aims. I've always kind of pushed back against these polarizing perspectives and thought it's much more important to understand the lived experiences of participants and their own voices. And so I want to start my talk with a quote by a Twitch streamer who goes by Kiwi. And Kiwi was talking to me about her experiences being one of the featured creators as part of Twitch's what they were calling their Black History Month, I think their creator incubator. And so she talked to me about the experiences of both, appearing on Times Square, but also getting a different kind of prime real estate, which is appearing at the landing page of Twitch for the entire month of February. And so I talked to her about this, and she said, she received a lot of attention from being in this digital space. Being in that position, she said, you'll see, are you okay with that? Yeah. You'll see your numbers go up. You'll see your discoverability go up. Otherwise, it's really, really hard to be seen. And she went on to discuss the acute challenges of algorithmically curated discoverability, especially for creators of color. She said, if your stream is not being consistently put in that position, you're not going to be found as easily. And so a lot of the complaints that Twitch streamers have is that it's kind of this same people every time, white, cisgendered men. But when we were talking to this, she also highlighted some of the downsides of newfound visibility. Perhaps not surprisingly, the potential for hate and harassment. She said, there's so much trolling and random people with no life and nothing else to do and to be hateful online. And they come in and they spam a bunch of messages me. And so she was drawing attention to these so-called hate raids. And so she said, in order to get rid of them, what you have to do is go through and delete your followers. And she said, there's been some creators who have lost all of their followings trying to purge the bots. And so in other words, Kiwi understands the logic of visibility that drives the platform economy, but she also acknowledges the risks and the downsides of what I'm thinking as a part of a visibility bind. And so in my talk today, I want to think about the social, political, and economic entanglements of the creator economy through visibility. and offer a sort of analytic framework that helps us unpack that. So my outline of my talk, I'll probably talk for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then do Q&A. I want to talk about essentially the promises, why people participate in the creator economy, what drives people to put themselves out there, and then flip the switch and think about the perils of visibility, including the risks of being too visible or alternatively not visible enough. And I use those two poles to think about kind of anchoring what I call the visibility bind, which I argue traps creators in a very precarious situation. And then we'll do Q&A. So visibility is such a fraught term, and it has been explored across various fields. I come from a media communication background, and so what I found especially useful is thinking about the historical valence of visibility, which is often conflated with representation, especially in early media writings, the idea that to be seen is to be acknowledged to matter, and to be concealed is to be what communication researchers called symbolically annihilated. Essentially, you don't matter if you're seen. And so that's really about representation. More recently, against the backdrop of the rise of the social media economy, there's been attention to what Sarah Banet-Weiser calls the economies of visibility, where being seen essentially routes the political valence of visibility towards economic ends. And if you're interested in kind of the precursors of this, you should read Alice 2013 book, Status Update, which really helps to situate this. And so there's this kind of tension here between the economies of visibility and the politics of visibility. And in thinking about how this applies to the creator economy, I felt like some things got lost in the middle. And so I came across this really brilliant article by Cesar Jimenez Martinez and Lee Edwards. I think it came out last year. And it talks about promotional culture is situated in a regime of visibility. And what I appreciate about this is it acknowledges the fact that within communication, visibility is an end goal itself. It's also a form of recognition, which in a lot of ways doubles down as surveillance, especially for marginalized communities. But it also has a level of transience. And Arvid and I have talked a lot about the kind of role of algorithms in this. And so I found this framework for promotional culture very useful, and have been thinking about what happens if we supplant kind of promotional regimes with the creator economy. So the creator economy, I feel like it's something you use in scare quotes, because I feel like nary a day goes by when you don't see the statistic that, it's a $250 billion industry. Essentially what I'm talking about is a subsector of the cultural economy that exists at the interface of creative industry and tech. And so the workers, and I have spent time in my earlier work trying to draw attention to the fact that this is labor, this is time-consuming process. They are independent workers who rely upon platforms for creation, distribution, marketing, and monetization of content. And this draws on the work of one of my collaborators who's here, David Nieborg. And when we're thinking about creators as a subsector of cultural labor, thinking about the fact that they are highly precarious and they're highly variable. And so we may have a sense of like what a creator does, but most of them are drawing together work on various platforms and also piecing together various income streams. And so you have like influencer creators who are also educators, those who are selling their merch, those who are running courses and consulting businesses. And so there's a lot of variety and flux in this. And the other element that I think it's important to kind of have as backdrop when we think of creators is like we have a sense, or a lot of people have a sense in the public imagination that like you just post content up there and you're going to become the next Mr. Beast making $50 million. Or there's this tendency to be sort of invoke moral panics. And so you may have seen the quite terrifying article about mothers who are putting their young girls on Instagram to draw attention. And so there's these kind of hyperbolic fears about the creator economy, or this like generational hand wringing, like, oh man, kids these days want to become influencers. A lot of this ignores the kind of social economic conditions that propel people to want to participate in these. And so, I want to draw attention to the fact that this is a livelihood for entertainers, artists, musicians, much as work in the creative industries long has been a driver. And with all of this confusion and hyperbole about what the creator economy is, as I said before, find it really important to actually talk to creators about their work, their experiences, their aspirations. And so I mentioned the book project that I'm working on now, which in some ways draws upon two separate studies I did with my graduate student researchers. One, we were looking at forms of algorithms, which amounted to a lot of invisibility. And the other was focused on influencers and how they are dealing, I hope the Firefox doesn't kill me, how they are facing an onslaught of hate and harassment. And I realized that these are essentially both about invisibility. And so beginning in 2022, I have conducted 50 interviews with influencers, creators, streamers about their experiences, quite fraught with visibility. So what I'm going to be presenting today is essentially an overview of the 80 interviews that I've done as part of this. What unites all of these workers and laborers is the compulsion to put yourself out there. This is not unique to creators, like dating sites are prodding people to participate in the PYOT challenge. You see these narratives of careerism hinging on putting yourself out there. The best way to increase your influence, put yourself out there. And so, this is kind of a larger neoliberal mandate that encourages all of us to embrace risk and shoulder the burden of various social structures. But I would argue that it is acutely experienced by participants in the creator economy, where there's this kind of requisite personal professional blurring. And so one of the ways to think about this is the fact that if you are a creator, your career depends on compulsory visibility. Again, being out there, melding your personal and professional lives for public display. And so in this quote here, Eliza was talking about the transition from like the WordPress model of blogs to the culture of Instagram. She said, all of a sudden you have to show yourself 24 hours a day on social media. Visibility is a huge part of my job. My whole life is part of my job. Another creator I interviewed, Mia, was talking about the risks involved in this kind of career. And I thought it was really telling and evocative that she described it as kind of a masochistic streak. And she's like, if I'm afraid of doing something, then I force myself to put myself out there. And, she said the idea of being online was terrifying for me, but I saw it as like a challenge, this interesting edge of my comfort zone. She said, why don't I just make myself do it? And so often when we're thinking about visibility in the creator economy, the terms are set by platform companies who, of course, are trying to attract attention and data. And so in this quote here from Ziggy, he drew attention to a tension that has long been very persistent in the creative industries, which is between inner drives, this inner sense of what's creative, and external pressures, commercial constraints. And so, he said, sure, it's hard to say, Ziggy, do what you want, post what you want, don't pay attention to the numbers. He said, but when the numbers dictate potential collaborations and opportunities for you to advance, it's really hard to ignore. And this, of course, echoes a lot of other accounts of kind of the fraught nature of metrics for workers in journalism and other individualized spaces. But this notion of how do I decide the kind of content I want to put out there in the world and reconcile with kind of the metric indices. And so why do people do this? I think, as I said before, we need to push back against the sense that people are just completely narcissistic. I mean, this is a livelihood for individuals, and there's a lot of promises of platform visibility. The first, of course, is the economic benefits. So Yolene talked about, you know, I enjoy putting content out there, but the amount of money I make. And second, she said, I've met 99% of my friends on here. It's often hard to get a sense of the scale of how much people make. And so Tori, a disability activist, kind of brought this into sharp relief by saying, like, I can't remember how much money I made. It was maybe 5,000. She said, and by 2021, it was, you know, 55K. And that last year we're into a 6-figure salary. I've long been kind of interested in this narrative of doing what you love, which shrouds attention and discussions within the creator economy. And so Erin said, you know, I found that I love doing it so much that I'm going to research it and monetize it and kind of go for it. And I think crucially, this dovetails quite nicely with the narrative that platform companies are pitching. And Arvin and I were talking about this yesterday, but there's really this sense that platform companies, mainstream platform companies, are shifting attention from courting users to courting aspiring creators because now they're so saturated. And so Facebook, Meta now has a Facebook for Creators initiative, and they quite explicitly say, you know, access monetization tools and earn money doing what you love. We've seen recent shifts in X trying to develop a program for aspiring creators where their content is rendered brand friendly. Snap has been investing in the creator economy in earnest and having various systems and tiers and so forth. And so when we think about, again, why are people compelled to do this, there's also the widespread narrative of success. But I don't want that to eclipse attention to the political reasons that people become involved in this career. And so the thinking about, as I mentioned before, the idea of representation and visibility is like social progress. Visibility gets enacted as social change or the promise of social change. And so Connie mentioned, Connie was a trans creator and mentioned the idea of like, she hadn't seen people like her growing up. And so this gave her a way to build a community and find systems of support. Tori, who I mentioned earlier, a disability activist that I've been working on this community for years, and to see this small series I'm doing reach millions of people, it's incredible. And so we put these up there because I think it's important to kind of acknowledge the fact that people's interests and aspirations are quite multivalent. Sasha similarly said, my passion started off as inclusion when I was posting. I'm a plus size fitness instructor. And so now being able to see women in fitness and push the conversation forward. So again, these really kind of have remind me a lot of the earlier claims and the progress enabled by traditional media visibility. But what about the downsides? What are the risks? And so there are many risks. Most of them disproportionately impact marginalized communities. And I think we can kind of situate these on an axis between invisibility and hypervisibility. So what are the risks of being invisible? Economic devaluation. Brands don't want to pay, creators don't want to pay because there's such a glut of people that are willing to work for free. The volatility of the platform landscape. I'll talk a little more about that. Work in the creative industries has always been precarious. You know, people who've worked in TV industry and film industry and books, you can't predict audience taste, but the kind of breakneck pace of change in these big tech companies has injected new sources of instability. And finally, the kind of role of algorithmic systems in adding a new layer of knowledge acquisition and also kind of seen as a threat or impediment, as Tana Bucher has talked about. So the risks of being invisible. This project doesn't devote a whole lot of time to what in my earlier work I called aspirational labor, essentially work people were doing with the expectation it would pay off, and they were kind of, in the sense, promoting for brands. And so, but I did hear about this on both the sides of the brand companies and creators not being willing to pay people for the work that they did. And so Ella talked about you know, she's like, you always hear these narratives about people being able to make a 6-figure salary, but they're accepting a bottle of sunscreen in exchange for 8 hours of work. And she said, that's crazy, but people do it. Mira talked about the challenge of tracking down brands who are willing to pay after you do the work, and the difficulties navigating that system without systems of support, including talent managers and agents. And I think it's important to note how these systems of exploitation often map onto traditional structures of inequality, including gender and race-based inequality. And so Nina told me a lot of brands will undersell creators. Nina is a Black creator and said, you know, especially if you're a POC creator, and she mentioned this study that came out that showed Black creators are getting paid 30% less than white creators. There's a piece that came out last year by Angel, Kristen, and Lou that taps into the dynamics of inequity along racial stratification. As I mentioned, there's also these risks of invisibility. Again, this is not completely new, but the volatility of the platform environment, this kind of moving fast and break things ethos, impacts creators acutely. And so we just have to look at the example of like Vine shuttering abruptly. And what do you do when your access to audiences and advertisers is suddenly thwarted? In the US, that should say TikTok. TikTok is not a new platform, despite what you think. And so there were a lot of fears, and this is kind of ebbed and flowed about what happens if TikTok is banned in the US. How do I reach my audiences? How do I maintain a livelihood when I'm relying on what platforms gatekeep? And so Mia said, you know, it makes me feel as it can arbitrarily be taken away. It's dependent on the algorithm. It's dependent on US-China relations and Congress. Just being a creator inherently exposes you to platform risk. Another threat which has come across in so many interviews is the fear that suddenly your content will be what's called a shadow ban, where essentially minimized or reduced without warning from the platform. And so creators of color in particular told me about situations where they would have suddenly throttled views and they would not be able to get the same sort of metrics they had, especially when they were posting on seemingly controversial or not brand-friendly topics. Nina said, every time I speak about TikTok's algorithm and how it's different for people of color, I always get hit with a content violation, or following on that, my videos will be shadow banned. Even more alarming for creators is the fact that you will suddenly be locked out of your account. I've heard, especially from adult performers and you know, seemingly progressive political bloggers about they'll wake up and they will not have access. They will be completely banned. What do you do in that situation? And so Carrie, an adult entertainer who draws people to her support through Instagram, talked about this kind of like daily waking up. I'm not sure if my account's going to be there. And she said the losses were devastating, tearful, emotional, scary, because you're like, I've become invisible. And she talked about the challenges of getting her account back up there. She said, no one is going to argue that my almost 4 million people Instagram account isn't incredibly valuable. So those, I kind of went quickly through the risks of invisible, but there's also some concerns about being hyper visible. And here, you know, this is certainly again, a much longer discussion within the role of how tech cultures engage in surveillance, especially of marginalized groups. Given time, I'm just going to kind of talk about a few of the risks of being hyper visible, which includes burnout, cultural appropriation, tokenism, being surveilled, as I mentioned, and targeted hate and harassment. Yeah, there's been a slew of articles in the media recently on creators' experiences with burnout, and I think that's kind of tied to the larger shift we're seeing in widespread work culture and kind of the quiet quitting and various ways to push back against what the contemporary workplace looks like. So Mia talked about the burnout of the creator, and I thought this was kind of a really telling quote here about what it means to have a job where you're performing for the algorithm, trying to condense everything into 3 to 3 minute sound bites. It's just a weird psychological state to always be trying to go viral. As I'm reading, I've been trying to condense everything into sound bites. I'm like, that's just like when you have to get 8,000 words for an article. Also, David here, who was a manager and had overseen, thank you, had overseen a lot of creator talent, talked about the experiences of what goes on behind it. And, you know, it weighs heavily on you when you're just mining your light for content. I remember years ago, I interviewed someone who, she was an aspiring influencer and had a pretty large account. And she was like, I'm going on my honeymoon. I don't want to take my camera, but I am going to lose my followers if I don't. And so, you know, we talk about not having an off switch, but this kind of brought it into keep a sharp relief here. Perhaps not surprisingly, many creators and influencers don't just deal with harassment, but it is, of course, incentivized by these platform cultures. And so Nadia talked about the notion of being a Twitch streamer where you have to cope with a lot of things, have a thick skin, this kind of thick skin rhetoric. And she talked about the hate raids where people would, you know, copy and paste and deploying bots to just stream automated hate and vitriol to people with, you know, and Twitch and eventually responded, but having very little systems of recourse. Ashley talked about the very toxic fans. Also drawing on Arvin's work, thinking about something I've only heard about in one interview, but is a direction I'm quite curious about, is the potential for these highly visible personalities, creators, to become the victim of deepfake non-consensual pornography. And so there was a few cases of Twitch and TikTokers, because they are in a lot of ways situated within this celebrity regime. They're dealing with the same sorts of attacks. And what I have heard consistently is, and this certainly goes well beyond this particular case, but the failures of platform companies to protect people. Again, there's various filtering and blocking mechanisms that people can use, but it relies you to go through and figure out what the boundaries are, what sorts of keywords may be triggered. And the other element comes back to what I mentioned in the beginning. Your career is incentivized by metrics. And so for you to conceal, block, ban forms of engagement, positive or negative, can also double back and threaten your livelihood. And so I've talked to people where they'll say, you know, kind of like all publicity is good publicity. Like there's no such thing as bad publicity. There's no such thing as negativity. But again, that's individual creators who shoulder the burden on this. So Nora said there's very little support. I've reported comments, awful things have happened. Heather said they don't do a good job of filtering out racist comments. You have to go through individually on your own. And so these paradoxical conditions where creators are facing, on one hand, the threat of not being seen, of being invisible, being concealed, not getting recognized within traditional structures. And on the opposite side, dealing with the risks of being hypervisible, of being seen too much, of being exploited, trap creators in what I'm calling a visibility bind. And perhaps not surprisingly, it disproportionately impacts marginalized creators. This so-called visibility bind, of course, emerges from the data-driven logics of platform companies that incentivize interaction and metric engagement. But as I said, there's these kind of paradoxical conditions of invisibility and visibility in which many creators report feeling trapped. I really like this quote by Buchanan. It's from, I think, organizational sociology, but I thought it was a very poignant for thinking about this bind, where they argue that in the workplace, hypervisibility and invisibility are contrast to visibility, yes, and represent different manifestations of the same oppressive forces, subjugation and devaluation. And so I want to, repeat what I just said about the conditions and consequences of this visibility bind being amplified for historically disadvantaged creator communities. So, we're thinking about policy initiatives and enacting change, and it's always hard being a critical researcher to just be like, this is the problem. And so, what are some positive things we're seeing from this? What are some ways to push back and see creators engage in resistance? I think despite the perverse power of these platform companies, there are ways that creators are resisting or challenging gaming these systems. One, which is more formal mechanisms, unions and collective action. There's now a creators union guild. In the UK, there's also efforts to engage in unionization. Arvin and I were talking about this yesterday too, like the challenges of not having a shop floor makes it hard to kind of replicate the exact same structures of union support, but I think that's quite telling. Creators will also find ways to push back against algorithmic systems of governance and visibility by working in what they call engagement groups. And so, essentially these are often anonymous groups where you will tell people to like your content at the same time in hopes that that boosts its ranking in the algorithm. Algo speak, which is, it kind of reminds me of, I guess it's a form of like social steganography. I'm looking at Dana and Alice. I have the hardest time saying steganography, by the way, so I'm proud of myself. And so algo speak, if you're not familiar, are sort of these creative workarounds people use in order to get their content seen without being flagged by the algorithm. And so instead of writing sex, they'll write like SEGGS. As the creator here said, I'm not going to write cross-dresser, gender fluid. They'll do things like G, A sign, Y instead of gay. And so these ways the creator communities find ways to contest the power of algorithmic systems. And in the final two slides, thinking about the ways in which creators play with visibility in ways that seem to suggest perhaps a tipped balance of power. We've seen creator boycotts where creators will say, okay, we're not posting on this day. We're going to draw absolutely no attention and no revenue to these platforms. And finally, for creators who have amassed enough attention to call out platform companies. And again, this comes with a certain degree of resources and power, but rather thinking about the ways in which to contest these power using your visibility rather than concealing it. Okay, so we're getting close to time. Just to wrap up and summarize, within this so-called creator economy, of course, we're seeing more and more efforts of creator companies to prod people to put themselves out there. And I think this is a really interesting shift that we're seeing from platform companies, again, courting users and saying, join our site, sign up. We want to enlist new users and saying, join our site and create content for us. You too could be the next star. But unfortunately, this visibility situation creates binding conditions, which are especially insidious for some marginalized communities. But the forms of resistance and kind of pushing back and contesting these power, I think, suggests that platform companies may have created a visibility bind for themselves by giving, creators various mechanisms of visibility. And in closing, I mean, I've been studying this community in various forms, and I think one of the reasons is because creators' experiences are acute in some ways because of their reliance on platform companies. But I don't think this is unique, and I've long been interested in kind of the parallels between academic labor and creator labor, and so I think I will leave it there as we consider how to release individuals and workers from the visibility bind. Thank you. Thanks to my collaborators.
Questions? Alice.
Brooke, thanks so much for this talk. It was fascinating as usual. I have a question about basically like the idea of invisibility through things like shadow banning, right? Where the thing about shadow banning is you don't know that you're getting shadow banned. And so it sort of engenders a lot of these like conspiracy theories and folk theories of algorithms. And we are starting to see some empirical evidence that, you know, we all know that shadow banning exists, and we know that it's more likely to apply to certain groups of creators. And I was talking to a friend of mine in trust and safety who made the argument that what the platform companies should be doing is being much more clear to people about why they're being shadow banned or why their content is being removed, and clarify the rules on the platforms. Like you can share PII of someone else, but it has to be X, Y, or Z. And if you share ABC, then you'll get shadow banned. And so that was something interesting when you thought about problems and solutions. I was starting to think about that as like maybe one way we could think about making content moderation more creator friendly, being more transparent about what content moderation decisions are. And I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yes.
Okay, great. We're done.
No, I mean, I think, you know, the opacity is the concern with this, because of course, like platform companies need to moderate. There are systems where we all would agree, and the gray areas where things get fuzzy, where we're not sure, and we all have different ideas about what should and should be banned and who should and shouldn't moderate this content. And that gray area is where suspicion gets circulates, emerges, gets amplified. And so creators very much would appreciate, based on my interviews, like more transparency into what these boundaries look like, because otherwise they're kind of relying on themselves and like A/B testing. I have heard nearly consistently that is the one thing they would like to see change, which is to have a direct line to someone at YouTube and TikTok. And the people who get reinstated do have some kind of line, whether they have friends that work there or they have kind of concealed ways to get some information on this. But that creates a barrier between who has access to the internal workers and who is just kind of relying on this this folk theorization. So I think the transparency issue is like what I would see as the number one kind of redressable challenge within this. And also, I mean, I think you're absolutely right in thinking about the way the conspiracy theorists have framed this, because that's the thing that I always get stuck on, because I'm like, well, of course these communities are being shadow banned, but we see the same sorts of claims from like the far right saying they've been shadow banned. And so I think having something that again is transparent about who is setting the boundaries and what happens in these cases would be really productive for creators. So thanks.
Dana.
Thanks, Brooke. This is great. As I listen to you talk through this, I keep thinking about the configuring work of both the platforms and the users in configuring these creators. And I keep thinking about what are some of the other kinds of cases that might teach us something relatedly. Mm-hmm. So my mind went to celebrity, right? And one of the things I keep coming to with celebrity is that scale matters, and that the speed of scale also matters. So, which is to say that, you know, aside from being a calculus nerd, like the idea that you can actually like go from 0 to 60 extremely fast, you end up with a dynamic that increases the likelihood in which somebody is going to end up unhealthy within the ecosystem. The flip side of it also is what it means to have to sustain that, right? And this made me think about your opening comment about your love, which is that musicians who are forced to play the fans' favorite song for the rest of their lives in order to make it work at dingy clubs wherever. Yeah. Right. So what is it to me, as you're thinking about the configuring elements of these actors, that makes this different or similar to something like the celebrity configuring? You know, where we have agents and, you know, who often operate as pimps, if you will. Mm-hmm. Where you have, you know, boxes, you have an economic configuration. So help me understand how this visibility configuration, what stands out to you as different from other configurations, or what to you is like an extension of old logics at a different scale and speed.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's the latter. It's an extension of industry logics, because you know, when you think about creators and what they are beholden to, they're beholden to advertisers and their interests and their expectations of like what does well, and they're beholden to audiences in their communities, even more so because they have this direct line of feedback. This isn't new. This is what anyone working in commercial creative industries has had to think about. And so these accounts of chasing the numbers, there's a quote from like Todd Gitlin's TV Sociology about predicting the unpredictable. You don't know what's going to do well with audience taste. You don't know, like the pandemic, we could not have anticipated that. And so, of course, there's always been a level of unpredictability, which I think drives people to this because, you could potentially be the star, the next star, and we don't know if, what the trends are going to be. What feels different about this is, you have a new force, which is the platform companies. Again, you have the audiences, the advertisers. Now you have a new force, and so that is, of course, going to configure you to different situations, but also the volatility of the platform environment. And so I say that, like, if you worked in the TV industry, yeah, your show may not do well, but there's like many other shows within a particular network. But with platform companies, because you depend so much on YouTube or TikTok, and you can't transfer audiences across those. And so that's what feels different to me, is like the role of platform companies and kind of puppeteering and setting these terms at the same time that they purport to be neutral. Because there's so many cases of this, and this kind of goes to Alice's question about the means of control they have. I don't know how many people heard about TikTok has this heating button and so I think a reporter from Bloomberg broke the story, but essentially we think about like TikTok's algorithm. This is where the virality is. This is what kind of locks people in. And, of course, TikTok is like, oh, it's the algorithm, who knows what's going to go viral, but they actually broke that there's like this heating button. And so I picture like the Wizard of Oz, someone being like, I'm going to heat this. Heating means making something go viral. And so you think about the kind of, the puppeteers behind all of this. And so I think it's part of it is just that there's a new actor, and part of it is that this actor has a level of control that doesn't allow people to kind of move across platforms in the same way.
Is that control the same though as like MGM free, the negotiation of the releasing of people's contracts?
I think it is. But that's like it within the MGM or within the traditional system. You're within a media industry that acknowledges their role in this to a certain level, and it acknowledges like the role in the content, whereas the tech companies again can like conceal their role behind the scenes.
The other big difference I would say is that a lot of content creators are performing a version of themselves. They're not taking on roles as actors per se. They're playing, they're talking about their own opinions or their own experiences. And I think that means that there's much more emotion and vulnerability in it, as opposed to somebody who's playing a role in a script that's generated by somebody else, and they're playing a different role every time.
Absolutely. And that, that exacerbates the vulnerability, because it's you, the person. I mean, even at MGM, and if you're working as an independent contractor, you're part of a union, there's still like a team of people and people you can talk to and connect with. And you may not be able to get like your boss at MGM on the line, but you can talk to someone in the industry, whereas these people are kind of like floating without the same mechanisms and structures of support.
Because I'm thinking early industry versus contemporary, where early there wasn't any of that support. You were locked in, and if you pissed off your boss, you were out forever. So that's part of why I'm wondering, like, can we learn from the iterations, right? Because one of the big iterations, of course, was the lawsuits that broke up the contracts, the permanent contracts.
In the studio system, and like whether they're cultivating users, and again to Alice's point, like no, they're not. So in some ways, they're not courting users, but they do allow people access to their creator fund, which enables them to monetize. And so in all of this, like they continue to conceal their impact behind the scenes. But like even like, and this is what I'm struggling with, this Black History Month initiative. I'm like, well, yes, it's great to grant visibility to marginalized communities who've been excluded. And so, Kiwi, who I mentioned at the beginning, is getting this visibility boost, which helps her career, but then the platform like disappears, and like you deal with the fallout. And so, but that too is like they are curating this list.
Jordan, and then me.
Yeah, thanks for this great presentation. Some of these last couple comments kind of nicely, I guess, fit in with where I was thinking, which is On this, like thinking of visibility as a continuum from invisibility to hypervisibility, sounded like it evokes for me almost a quantitative thinking about visibility, like more or less. And it makes me wonder whether there's a qualitative dimension to it too. So for instance, creators that use their own like offline persona versus those that use a different persona, is that even at the same level, so to speak, of visibility? Are there like differences there? Are there cross-platform differences in visibility, even for the same like reach, if we can compare the reach? And then within a platform, like you mentioned in these Black History Month programs or whatever you would call them on the platforms, like it made me curious whether people promoted under these are promoted in the same way, or do you know that they are being promoted as a part of this corporate initiative? And it made me wonder about like, you know, the research on affirmative action and how people who are perceived as being affirmative action hires or other things are like, there's like a stigma to that. So I wondered, are people like, is visibility all the same? Is it quantitative? Like the more, or is it only quantitative? Like the more you're visible or the less you're visible, or are there also like different kinds of visibility, even at the same like quantitative reach, if that's even a fair way to talk about what you were describing?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's interesting to think about the spectrum of qualitative and quantitative. I mean, I would say there's definitely a qualitative dimension, and part of it makes me think of the fact that how people like who can say that they have an invisible cadre of workers behind them to provide support. And so if you're a top tier creator, that enables, you know, you need the resources, you need support, but you know, you have workers behind the scenes and behind the screens who are helping to build your brand. But these social media workers and laborers are also dealing with forms of you know, the hate and harassment, but it's not targeted directly at them. It's not like commenting on their particular persona, because they are meant to remain hidden. Like this goes back to all kinds of questions of like authenticity and fakery and so forth. The other part of your question was about, on platforms. Yeah, I think part of it, it depends what the aim is. And so if people are talking about monetizing this, then the best visibility is on YouTube. I've heard like consistently, that's where people are able to have some semblance of security. TikTok people describe as you get the viral hit and then you kind of fade away. And so you just keep going on with the cycle. People talk about, and many creators' experiences are different, but they also have kind of a set of how they think about like where the worst trolls are. And so it's been interesting to kind of hear where people say, Instagram is absolutely the worst for trolls, and like TikTok is a very supportive community. And so I haven't quite made sense because it's so variable, but I think yeah, I think it's quite nuanced when we think about not just the quantity and how we're thinking about like what the threshold is, because the threshold is quite different for everyone, but also the nuance that comes with these forms of visibility. And again, visibility, not just like for whom, but to whom. Are we thinking about visibility with audiences or advertisers? Or like if you care about you know, you may have a very small following, but a particular political affiliation like picks you up. And so I think it's quite nuanced. That's interesting to articulate that. So thanks.
Yeah, great sort of provocations. I guess, you know, thinking about the monetization strategies, right? So one seems to be a revenue sharing agreement with the platform. So the platform is sort of saying, I'll share some revenue with you. Here are the terms. Here's what you live with. Another seems to be a direct relationship with an advertiser where you're promoting. And so do you see differences in creators who have different models? And so, you know, is the model where your advertiser supported give you more or less flexibility in sort of representing yourself? And part of that, you know, I'm thinking also sort of, you know, we've in political influencers say we want more, we demand more when the advertiser is the politician versus somebody who's just getting revenue. So how have you seen people interact with those issues?
Yeah, that's an interesting corollary in terms of the political influence. Part of it comes from, I think, what the creators like brand niches. And so, you know, if we're talking about someone in the tech space, that is the monetization strategy could be quite different from someone in the beauty space versus someone in the political realm. And so to give a more some specific examples, in order to participate in any one of these monetization schemes that the platforms control, you need to have a certain threshold and you need to meet geographic requirements where I think TikTok allows people only in, we're talking about this today, like 3 countries to actually monetize. And so if you become part of that, you have more stability because you are only trying to curry favor with audiences, where if you have brand deals and monetization, it shapes your content in a more direct way. You have to think about, like, again, how can I integrate this particular product brand message into my existing arsenal of content? And it also, it's much more, you're much more contractually bound. And so if you partner with an advertiser, you know, you partner with a bottled water company, you usually have brand deals that are like, you need to produce X pieces of content across 4 platforms and get this many shares and metrics. Whereas if you are a member of YouTube's creator fund, you just need to kind of get access and then you monetize on yourself. And so I think it's a kind of different set of orientations.
Yeah. Hi, really nice presentation. And I want to go back to the content moderation because I have a friend who's an influencer on Chinese TikTok, and she recently talked about some problems she encountered about content moderation and the algorithm mediation. Like, she mentioned that Chinese TikTok has a really strict algorithm detecting like inappropriate behaviors, for example, like pornography. So like it seems like the algorithm is detecting how much skin you show in the video. And so sometimes when she was like post a vlog about her vacation and she's wearing a dress, and the algorithm will detect it as inappropriate content and then shadow ban her or like even ban her. Like, so and on the one hand, she feels like, oh, this kind of algorithm is good for the platform because she doesn't want the platform is full of like inappropriate like content. And on the other hand, it really ruins her visibility to like audience and her fans. Yeah, I'm wondering, like, how do you feel like this balance of content moderation and visibility of like creators?
It's really hard. And I think going back to the comment from Alice about transparency, because people just don't know. And, you know, I think many people know someone who's been like erroneously flagged. And so, you know, you're like, why did I get banned for this? This is totally tame. There's nothing, you know, borderline content is the term. And so like for us as users, it's frustrating. And we're like, oh, you know, Facebook messed up, and like, oh, stupid Twitter banned me and whatever. But for these people, their careers are dependent upon this level of visibility. And so, you know, thinking about how you ensure not just you, but your audiences exist within a safe space. And you also can get the kinds of content you want to get out there. And so, you know, we saw this in the US and UK with the adpocalypse, where all of a sudden, you know, there was just like the fact that consumer brands, their content was being paired with like extremist content without their knowledge. I mean, this has like ripple effects where we're now seeing the same sorts of exodus with Twitter/X. And so it's challenging because, again, you're thinking about going back to like that, navigating that delicate balance between audiences and advertisers. With the platform, you have to think about their content moderation mechanisms and like what brand friendliness is, which is very different for everyone. And you know, depending on the type of content you produce, again, it goes back to this like long-standing tension between creativity and constraints. This is what I want to put out there in the world. This is me showing like my picture on a beach, but you know, this particular platform is flagging this erroneously. So yeah, I think it's kind of a grueling balance.
Yes, thanks. I love focus on influencers and creators, and I appreciate the angle of discussing them as workers. But when I start thinking about this, and then I think about other working conditions and recent concerns about algorithmic surveillance of workers, it seems like the conditions at present are really beyond the pale. Like this is actually just the amount of labor they're doing, the amount they're being remunerated, the amount of surveillance they have to undergo, the uncertainty. And so I wonder, there's some sort of saying, we want to understand why they're doing it at the beginning, but do you think it is appropriate to say that this is just in general completely unacceptable? Like there's not a version of this which a slight tweak would make a reasonable labor environment? Or what reforms do you think would get us there?
Yeah, in terms, I mean, your first comment about the, thinking about it of work, I mean, I think we can broaden it to think like this is a form of gig work. This is a form of independent work. And, there's different spins that people put on it. Is it entrepreneurship? Is it independent employment? Is it freedom from the 9 to 5? And so that's an element of it. I mean, work is, there's this like notion, should we think about work like kind of breaking down the binary between good and bad and thinking about what would make the conditions more favorable for people to flourish and find, economic success. And I think it's, in all cases, it's a trade-off. I mean, like these creators, some of them are, many of them are quite under-resourced, but also, this is a particular category of labor that is much more associated with like knowledge work than if we're using like the old like white collar versus blue collar. And so there is a level of privilege that's separating these people from the sweatshop. And so I think we need to kind of like acknowledge that there are various conditions, but in terms of what would make it better within the system, I mean, they do need, well, I mean, I guess we'll see what happens with Substack, but like the platforms as part of this platform contingency, like people are contingent on this. And now we're seeing new models where people are much more dependent on subscription. And so the question of like what good and bad work looks like, I think that's going to be an interesting comparison where some people are relying on brands, some people relying on platform partnerships, and some are relying exclusively on subscription. And so each has its trade-off. Like the subscription model with the Patreon and the Substack, like it's just you and your audience. And so that goes back to the patronage model, but that's the system of like failure and success is all on you, and people have to come to your Substack. And so I think it's really a trade-off with like who you want your boss to be. I think the reality is like we all have a boss. Do you want it to be the platform companies? Do you want it to be the brand advertisers, or do you want it to be your audience?
I think that's really illustrative thinking about the difference between the Substack model and this moderate, like this algorithmically mediated, and with this other person with the button on it. That's super nice.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right, it's almost 1:30. I don't know if you can stay a little bit longer. I have to
Yeah.
run to a meeting, but let's thank Professor Duffy, and if you want to stay for longer.
Yeah.